You wake to the smell of coffee brewing. Light filters through a square porthole beside your berth, soft and diffused. And there, waiting just outside your privacy curtain, your shoes, polished to a shine while you slept. You hadn't asked, you hadn't expected it. But somewhere in the night, 10,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, a steward collected them, buffed them in a galley no bigger than a closet, and returned them before dawn. The year is 1939. 10,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the afternoon light slants through square portholes, catching the crystal glasses on a table draped in Irish linen. Somewhere below, there is only water, endless, impossibly blue water stretching to every horizon. And here, in a cabin panelled in soft beige and touches of blue and green, 40 passengers are sitting down to lunch. This is the Boeing 314 Clipper, and it is, quite simply, unlike anything the world has ever seen. Can you imagine it? An airplane with a dining room. An airplane with sleeping berths and dressing rooms and a honeymoon suite. An airplane where you might spend 4 or 5 days crossing the Pacific and never once feel rushed, never once feel cramped, never once wish you were somewhere else. The smell of roast beef drifts from a galley no bigger than a closet. White-coated stewards move between the tables, pouring coffee from silver pots. Through the windows, clouds drift past like slow ships, and beneath it all, the steady, reassuring thrum of 4 Wright engines, 1,600 horsepower each, carrying this improbable vessel toward Hawaii, toward Midway, toward the other side of the world. The Clippers were born from necessity and became something like magic. Pan American Airways needed aircraft that could cross oceans. In the late 1930s, that meant flying boats, planes that could land on water, because there weren't enough runways in the world to support transoceanic flight. The stepping stone islands of the Pacific had lagoons, not landing strips. So Pan Am went to Boeing with an audacious request: build us an airplane that can carry passengers in comfort across the largest ocean on Earth. What Boeing delivered was astonishing: a wingspan of 152 feet, a length of 109 feet, twice the size of any flying boat that had come before. And inside was something no one had ever put in an airplane: a real dining room, real beds, real china and sterling silver, separate dressing rooms for men and women, a bridal suite tucked away at the rear of the aircraft, with a love seat and a concealed wash basin, and privacy that newlyweds would remember for the rest of their lives. This wasn't just an airplane, this was a flying hotel, and it came with a flying hotel's price tag. A one-way ticket from San Francisco to Hong Kong cost $760, the equivalent of roughly $17,000 today. Round trip across the Atlantic from New York to Southampton ran $675. These were fares for the wealthy, the powerful, the adventurous few who could afford to travel in a style that most people could only dream about. But here's what's remarkable. Even in the depths of the Great Depression, the Clippers captured America's imagination. They appeared on postage stamps and product labels. There were Clipper songs, Clipper dances, Clipper toys. In a country struggling through hard times, these magnificent flying boats represented something precious: hope, progress, the promise that the future might be brighter than the present. Pan American understood this. They borrowed the name Clipper from the great sailing ships of the 19th century, those elegant vessels that had once raced around Cape Horn. The crews wore navy blue uniforms, the captains kept watches just as captains had done at sea. Even the language was nautical. Passengers didn't fly, they sailed through the air. 12 Boeing 314 Clippers were built between 1938 and 1941. 9 flew for Pan Am. They were given names that evoked the nation and its ambitions: California Clipper, Honolulu Clipper, Yankee Clipper, Atlantic Clipper, Dixie Clipper, American Clipper. And for a brief shining moment, less than 3 years of commercial service before Pearl Harbor changed everything, these flying hotels carried passengers across the Pacific and Atlantic in a style that has never quite been matched. Let me take you aboard. You arrive at the marine terminal in San Francisco or New York with your luggage, and your luggage is weighed along with you. Every pound matters on a flight this long. Pan Am allows 77 pounds of baggage free of charge. Beyond that, you'll pay $3.25 for every extra pound. The Clipper's range depends on keeping weight in check, so even wealthy passengers learn to pack light. Then comes the boarding. Not up a gangway, not through a jetway, you walk out onto the broad lateral platforms called sponsons, those wing-like extensions at the waterline that stabilize the aircraft when it floats. Salt air, the lap of water against the hull. The massive curve of the fuselage rising above you like a silver whale. You step through a door and into another world. The first thing you notice is the space. This doesn't feel like an airplane. The ceiling is high enough to stand comfortably. The carpet, lightweight but thick enough to muffle footsteps, runs the length of the lower deck. The walls are painted in colors chosen by a New York expert named Howard Ketchum: Miami sand beige, Pan American blue, skyline green. These are colors designed to feel open, to reduce any sense of claustrophobia. Light flows through portholes made of plastic rather than glass, lighter weight, softer illumination. The interior was designed by Norman Bell Geddes, the visionary industrial designer who had already transformed the look of Pan Am's earlier flying boats. Bell Geddes believed that aircraft interiors should do more than function, they should delight. He specified Art Deco lines, modern contours, furniture frames made of lightweight duralumin. The cushions beneath you are stuffed with latex mixed with horsehair imported from Australia. Even the window blinds are special, accordion pleated rollers made of a washable material called tontine. Every detail has been considered, every ounce has been weighed. The lower deck is divided into 11 sections, and walking through them feels like touring a miniature ocean liner. 5 passenger compartments, each capable of seating 10 during the day or sleeping 6 at night. A deluxe compartment at the rear, the famous bridal suite. A 14-seat dining lounge, a galley. Separate restrooms and dressing rooms for men and women, the ladies' room equipped with stools for applying makeup and mirrors lit for flattering effect. A spiral staircase connects the lower deck to the upper deck, where passengers rarely venture. Up there is the flight deck, the crew quarters with their 3 canvas bunks and a vast baggage hold. But the engineering marvel that most passengers never see lies within the wings themselves. Inside each massive wing is a crawlway, a passage through which crew members can access the engines during flight. If something goes wrong over the middle of the Pacific, a flight engineer can actually climb into the wing and make repairs at 10,000 feet. The scale of the Clipper takes some getting used to. At 82,500 pounds fully loaded, it dwarfs anything else in the sky. Its wingspan would stretch nearly to the goal line if you stood it upright on a football field. 4 Wright GR 2600 twin Cyclone engines, 14 cylinders each, produce a combined 6,400 horsepower, enough to lift this flying hotel off the water and carry it 3,685 miles before needing to refuel. But numbers don't capture what it feels like to be aboard. What it feels like is this: substantial. The vibration of the engines reaches you through the deck, but it's gentle, almost soothing. The sound is a steady thrum, not a roar. The cabin is better insulated than most aircraft of the era. When the Clipper lifts off the water, there's none of the sharp acceleration you might expect. It rises slowly, almost reluctantly, then climbs with patient determination toward cruising altitude. And then you look out the window and see the sponson below you, spray still glistening on its surface, and beyond it the ocean falling away. And beyond that, nothing but horizon, and you understand that you are doing something that almost no one in human history has ever done. You are crossing an ocean through the sky, in comfort, with linen napkins and sterling silver waiting in the dining room. Wellwood Beale designed this aircraft. He was just 27 years old, a Boeing engineer who sketched the plans in his spare time after Boeing's management initially declined to compete for Pan Am's contract. His wife, an artist, rendered the interior drawings. When Boeing finally submitted the design, Pan Am accepted it, and Beale was promoted to lead a team of 11 engineers who would turn his vision into reality. The first Clipper, the Honolulu Clipper, flew in June 1938. By January 1939, the California Clipper had entered regular service, and for passengers who climbed aboard that first year, the experience must have felt like stepping into the future. A future that smelled of coffee brewing in the galley and horsehair cushions warmed by afternoon sun. A future that sounded like the clink of crystal and the murmur of conversation in 6 different languages. A future painted in Miami sand beige and Pan American blue, floating 10,000 feet above the Pacific. The journey from San Francisco to Hong Kong took 6 days. Think about that for a moment. 6 days in an airplane, or rather 6 days with an airplane because the clipper itself was only part of the experience. The route ran like this: San Francisco to Honolulu, 19 hours of flying, then Honolulu to Midway, Midway to Wake Island, Wake to Guam, Guam to Manila, Manila to Hong Kong. At each stop, passengers disembarked. They spent the night in hotels that Pan Am had built, or in places like Midway and Wake had essentially constructed from scratch. The next morning, rested and fed, they reboarded for the next leg. But that first leg, San Francisco to Honolulu, was the longest, the most demanding, the one that couldn't be broken up with an overnight stop. For 19 hours, passengers would live aboard the clipper, sleeping in berths while the Pacific passed beneath them in darkness. What was that like? Let me walk you through a day and night aboard. Morning arrives gently at 10,000 feet. You wake in a berth that reminds you of a Pullman sleeping car, a comfortable mattress, crisp sheets, a privacy curtain that pulls across to give you your own small world. Light filters through the porthole beside you. You've been asleep for hours, rocked by the subtle motion of the aircraft, and somewhere in the night, something remarkable happened. Your shoes are waiting for you, polished to a shine. You hadn't asked. You hadn't expected it. But while you slept, a steward collected the shoes from outside your curtain, polished them in the galley, and returned them before dawn. It's a small thing, but it tells you everything about the world you've entered. You rise, use the dressing room. The men's room has its own facilities. The women's room, its makeup stools and mirrors, and emerge to find that the overnight compartments are being transformed. The berths fold away. The cushions return. What was a sleeping car becomes, over 30 minutes of quiet work by the stewards, a comfortable daytime lounge. Breakfast appears. Coffee in a silver pot. Eggs prepared in the tiny galley, which measures just 4 feet square but somehow contains everything needed to serve 40 passengers. Fresh rolls. Fruit. The galley holds an aluminum icebox, a combination stove and steamer, a drip coffee maker. 200 fine china plates are racked in a cabinet designed to absorb turbulence. The stewards, there are 2 aboard, recruited from the finest hotels, have been working since before you woke. After breakfast, the day unfolds at its own pace. Some passengers read, others play cards in the lounge. Some simply sit by the portholes and watch the ocean slide past, impossibly far below, impossibly blue. The horizon stays empty for hours. There's nothing to see but sea and sky and clouds, and somehow that's enough. Can you imagine having nothing to do but look at the sky? Lunch arrives at the proper hour, served in the 14-seat dining room. The tables are draped in linen. Crystal glasses catch the light. The Gorham sterling silver, 350 pieces in the modern pattern, feels solid in your hand, substantial, real. The stewards serve 5 courses, sometimes 6. A documented menu from a Midway stopover in 1936 lists the offerings: anchovy canapé, celery, queen olives, chicken broth, prime roast beef au jus, mashed potatoes, spinach, fruit salad. One passenger remembered it this way. It was a conventional supper: grapefruit, celery and olives, soup, steak, vegetables, salad, ice cream, cake and coffee. The captain acted as though we were his guests. And perhaps that's the right way to think of it. You weren't a passenger being transported, you were a guest being hosted. The afternoon passes. Some passengers nap in the lounge chairs. Others write letters. There's a leather-covered writing table in the bridal suite, though any passenger might borrow paper and pen. The light changes as the sun moves across the sky. The engine note stays steady, that constant thrum that becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. Then evening comes and the transformation begins again. At dusk, with the sky turning gold and then purple through the portholes, the stewards move through the compartments, converting them for night. Each compartment takes 30 minutes. The day seats fold away, revealing the berths beneath. 6 beds in each standard compartment, 4 on the starboard side, 2 on the port, each fitted with a privacy curtain, down pillows, wool blankets. The particular quiet of nighttime at altitude, broken only by the engines and the soft sounds of 40 people settling in for sleep. The bridal suite at the very rear of the aircraft offers something more. A 3-cushion davenport converts into upper and lower berths. There's a love seat, a coffee table, a mirror, a wardrobe. Newlyweds who began their honeymoon on a clipper would tell the story for decades, and then night falls over the Pacific. The cabin lights dim. The portholes show nothing but darkness and stars. More stars than most passengers have ever seen, because out here, 1,000 miles from the nearest city, there's no light to dim them. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river. You sleep. 10,000 feet above the ocean, carried by 4 engines and the skill of a crew you've barely glimpsed, you sleep. And in the morning when you wake, Hawaii will be visible through the porthole. Your shoes will be polished and waiting, and breakfast will be served on fine china because that's simply how things are done aboard a clipper. But we haven't yet talked about that galley, that tiny, impossible galley where 2 stewards somehow produced miracles. We haven't talked about the crew who flew through the night while passengers slept. We haven't talked about the people whose labor made this floating world possible. That's where we're going next. The galley measured 4 feet square. 4 feet. Picture your bathroom at home. Now imagine fitting a restaurant kitchen inside it. That's what Pan Am's engineers and stewards accomplished aboard the Clipper. Step into that tiny space and you'd find a linoleum floor, easy to clean, an aluminum sink just 12 inches by 10, a drip coffee maker, an aluminum icebox, a combination stove and steamer for warming the meals that had been prepared before takeoff. And cabinets, remarkable cabinets, designed to hold everything needed to serve 40 passengers' meals that would rival a fine hotel. One cabinet contained a 2-tiered dish rack capable of holding 200 fine china plates secured against turbulence, glass racks, cup racks, saucer racks, 8 drawers for utensils and linens. A separate cabinet held the silver 350 pieces of Gorham sterling in the modern pattern, along with a silver-plated tea set and 10 pairs of sterling salt and pepper shakers. All told, nearly 1,000 serving items weighing 235 pounds, and typically 256 pounds of food for a single transoceanic flight. Think about those numbers for a moment. On an aircraft where every pound mattered, where passengers were weighed along with their luggage, where engineers had specified plastic portholes instead of glass to save weight, Pan Am chose to carry sterling silver. Real silver, heavy and substantial, that clinked against fine china with a sound that said, "You are somewhere special." That choice tells you everything about what the Clipper meant to be. The food was prepared before departure by chefs recruited from 4-star hotels. These weren't airline caterers, that concept barely existed yet. These were men who had trained in grand kitchens, who understood French technique and classic presentation, and who now found themselves adapting their skills for the peculiar demands of cooking at altitude. The meals arrived aboard in specialized containers, ready to be warmed and served by the 2 stewards who managed everything in that tiny galley. And what meals they were! 5 courses for lunch, 6 courses for dinner. Passengers didn't just eat, they dined in the formal sense of the word, at tables dressed in linen with crystal glasses catching the light through the portholes. A menu from a Midway Island stopover in October 1936 gives us a glimpse. Anchovy canapé to start, followed by celery and queen olives, chicken broth. Then the main course, prime roast beef au jus with mashed potatoes and spinach, fruit salad to finish, coffee served from silver pots by stewards in white coats who moved through the 14-seat dining room as smoothly as if they were working in a restaurant that never swayed, never vibrated, never climbed through clouds. One passenger left behind a description that captures the atmosphere perfectly. It was a conventional supper: grapefruit, celery and olives, soup, steak, vegetables, salad, ice cream, cake and coffee. And then the telling detail. The captain acted as though we were his guests, not customers, not passengers even, guests. The dining room seated 14 at a time, which meant that on a full flight, passengers took meals in shifts, but no one minded. The room was intimate, conversational. You found yourself seated across from strangers and discovered by the time dessert arrived that one was a diplomat bound for Manila, and another was a businessman with interests in Shanghai, and a third was a newlywed on her way to honeymoon in Hawaii. The Clipper created a curious democracy of the air. Everyone aboard had paid dearly for the privilege. This wasn't steerage, where you might find a mix of fortunes. But within that rarefied company, the shared experience of flying across an ocean dissolved the usual barriers. You dined together, you watched the sunset together, you slept, separated only by curtains, through the same long Pacific night. And through it all, the stewards kept the silver polished and the coffee hot. About 300 pounds of food was loaded for a transatlantic crossing. For the Pacific route, with its longer legs, even more might be required. The logistics were formidable. Ice had to stay cold, bread had to stay fresh, and everything had to survive the particular challenges of altitude, where water boils at lower temperatures and taste buds work differently than they do on the ground. The stewards managed it all. They prepared and served every meal. They converted the compartments from day to night configuration and back again. They polished passengers' shoes while the owners slept. They learned names and preferences and anticipated needs before they were expressed. And they did it in a workspace the size of a closet, at 10,000 feet over the middle of the largest ocean on Earth. While passengers slept beneath wool blankets, the Clipper's crew kept watch through the night. And their world, the world of the flight deck, the navigator's charts, the radio operator's headphones crackling with distant signals, was as remarkable as anything in the passenger cabins below. A Clipper crew numbered at least 10, though on longer flights this might expand to 16. The positions were borrowed from nautical tradition: captain, first officer, navigator, radio operator, flight engineer, watch officer. 2 stewards handled the passengers, and because the flights were so long, 19 hours from San Francisco to Honolulu, sometimes longer depending on headwinds, the crew worked in shifts, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, cycling through the night like sailors standing watch at sea. Pan Am didn't assign just anyone to fly the Clippers. These were the elite of the elite, the most experienced pilots in American commercial aviation. Before a captain could take the controls of a 314, he needed thousands of hours of flight time in other seaplanes and flying boats. The co-pilots and first officers met the same standard. Experience wasn't preferred, it was required. The training was rigorous and unrelenting. Dead reckoning, time turns, judging drift from sea current. Celestial navigation, the ancient art of finding your position by the stars, adapted for an aircraft moving at 183 miles per hour through the dark. Radio navigation, using signals from ground stations to triangulate location. Every crew member was cross-trained. Everyone could step in if needed, and they needed to be ready for anything. The Pacific offered no emergency landing strips, no diversion airports, no second chances. If something went wrong 1,000 miles from land, the crew had to solve it themselves. Consider this remarkable fact. Inside the massive wings of the Boeing 314 was a crawlway, a passage through which a flight engineer could access the engines during flight. If an engine developed trouble over the open ocean, a crew member could actually climb into the wing, troubleshoot the problem, and attempt repairs at altitude. It was dangerous work, cramped and loud and buffeted by slipstream, but it could mean the difference between reaching Hawaii and going down at sea. The pilots developed skills that seem almost magical in hindsight. In conditions of poor visibility, fog rolling across a harbour, clouds sitting heavy on the water, a Clipper captain might land his aircraft out at sea, beyond the weather, and then taxi the flying boat into port. Imagine that for a moment, landing a 40-ton airplane on open ocean swells, then motoring it like a ship into a fogged-in harbour you couldn't even see. Behind the cargo compartment, the crew quarters offered 3 tube and canvas bunks for rest between shifts. Basic accommodations, nothing like the passenger berths below. The crew didn't expect luxury. They expected to work, and to work well, and to deliver their passengers safely to the next port of call. The stewards occupied a curious position between crew and passenger. They lived in that tiny galley, they ate whatever they could grab between courses, and they were on their feet for most of the flight. But they also interacted with passengers constantly, learning names and faces, remembering that one guest took tea with lemon and another needed an extra blanket at night. Pan Am recruited them from the finest hotels, men who understood service as an art. Their white coats became synonymous with the Clipper experience, a flash of white moving through the cabin, a silver pot extended for a refill, a pair of polished shoes returned to a sleeping passenger before dawn. And there were others, too, whose work passengers never saw. At Pan Am's maintenance facilities in New York and San Francisco, teams of mechanics kept the Clippers flying. A typical overhaul took 2 days and required 141 mechanics, working 3 8-hour shifts around the clock, washing the aircraft, inspecting every system, replacing parts, testing and retesting until everything met Pan Am's exacting standards. In February 1942, after the men had gone to war, 40 women were hired at LaGuardia to work as mechanics in the hangars. They learned to service and repair and overhaul the clippers just as the men had done, keeping the aircraft flying through the difficult years that followed. The crew, the stewards, the mechanics, the cooks who prepared the meals before departure, the workers who loaded 300 pounds of food and 235 pounds of serving items into that tiny galley, the people who built the hotels on Midway and Wake Island so passengers would have somewhere to sleep between flights. Behind every elegant meal, every polished shoe, every smooth landing in a fogged-in harbour, there were people, skilled people, dedicated people, people who understood that they were creating something that had never existed before. A flying hotel, and everyone who worked aboard one knew that they were part of something extraordinary. The golden age of the Clipper lasted less than 3 years. On September 3, 1939, war broke out in Europe. Within weeks, Pan Am abandoned the Northern Atlantic route to Southampton. It had operated for barely 3 months. Flights continued to neutral Lisbon, but the romance had dimmed. Military passengers and priority cargo took precedence. The white coats of the stewards gave way to grimmer purposes. Then came December 7, 1941. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Clipper was in the middle of its route, somewhere near New Zealand. The crew faced an impossible choice: fly back toward Hawaii and risk being shot down by Japanese fighters, or find another way home. Captain Robert Ford chose the latter. He turned his aircraft west and began a journey that would become legendary. Starting from Auckland on December 8, 1941, the Pacific Clipper flew west around the entire world. Surabaya, Karachi, Bahrain, Khartoum, Leopoldville, across the Atlantic to Brazil, then up to New York. Over 31,500 miles, through war zones and unfamiliar territory, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial observation, landing in harbours the crew had never seen. On the morning of January 6, 1942, the Pacific Clipper touched down at Pan American's LaGuardia seaplane base. It was the first and only commercial aircraft to fly around the world westward across the Pacific. But commercial Clipper service was over. The military took control of the fleet. The aircraft kept flying, but now they carried soldiers and supplies instead of honeymooners and diplomats. The china and silver were packed away. The bridal suites became cramped quarters for troops heading overseas. Over the course of the war, the Clippers carried more than 84,000 passengers on missions of military importance. They flew supplies to British forces in Egypt and Soviet forces in Iran. They transported generals and admirals to distant commands. And in January 1943, the Dixie Clipper carried President Franklin D. Roosevelt to the Casablanca Conference, the first time a sitting American president had traveled by air. Roosevelt celebrated his birthday aboard the Clipper, eating cake in the dining room that had once served roast beef to wealthy tourists. The world had changed utterly. The flying hotels had become flying workhorses, and when the war ended, they were already obsolete. During the conflict, the Allies had built concrete runways across the globe, airfields capable of handling heavy bombers, which could just as easily handle passenger aircraft. The flying boat's great advantage had disappeared. You no longer needed to land on water when every major city had a runway. New aircraft were coming too: the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-4. Faster planes, easier to fly, requiring far less training and maintenance than the demanding Clippers. The war had accelerated aviation technology by decades. The elegant flying boats that had represented the future in 1939 looked like relics by 1945. Pan American was offered the chance to buy back its Clippers after the war. The airline declined. The era was over. The California Clipper made the last Pan Am Clipper flight in 1946. By then, it had accumulated more than 1 million flight miles, a testament to the engineering and the care of the crews who had maintained it through peace and war. But there was no place for flying boats in the jet age that was coming. The California Clipper was retired like all her sisters. Of the 12 Boeing 314s built, 3 had been lost to accidents during the war. Only one, the Yankee Clipper, which crashed while landing at Lisbon in February 1943, resulted in fatalities. 24 passengers and crew died that day, including the American war correspondent Benjamin Robertson. The singer Jane Froman survived, though badly injured. The remaining Clippers scattered to small charter operators after the war, flying diminished routes to diminished destinations. One by one, they wore out or were sold for scrap. By 1951, none remained. The last intact 314 was broken up, its aluminum sold by the pound, its history measured only in photographs and memories. None survive today. Not one of the 12 flying hotels that once crossed oceans with sterling silver and linen napkins and honeymoon suites. If you want to see a Boeing 314, you'll have to visit the Foynes Flying Boat Museum in Ireland, where a full-size replica sits on the site of the original transatlantic terminal. It's a replica, but it's something. And yet, the Clippers flew for less than 3 years of regular commercial service, a brief moment really in the long history of aviation. The war came, and the world changed, and faster planes with longer runways replaced the elegant flying boats forever. But something lingers. Over the course of their careers, the 12 Boeing 314 ES made approximately 5,000 ocean crossings. They flew more than 12.5 million miles. Each aircraft accumulated over 18,000 flight hours. They carried presidents and pilots, honeymooners and diplomats, businessmen bound for Shanghai and tourists heading home with stories they'd tell for the rest of their lives. And what stories they were. Waking to polished shoes, dining on roast beef at 10,000 feet, silver heavy in your hand, the Pacific sliding past the portholes like a dream, sleeping in berths while stars wheeled overhead. More stars than you'd ever seen, because out there above the ocean there was nothing to dim them. The crew who stood watch through the night, the stewards who learned your name by the second morning, the captain who acted as though you were his guest. Can you imagine? For a brief, shining moment, human beings created something extraordinary. An airplane that was also a hotel. A journey that was also a destination. A way of travelling that said, you matter, your comfort matters. The hours between departure and arrival matter. The Clippers are gone now. All of them. The California Clipper, the Dixie Clipper, the Yankee Clipper, and all the rest, scrapped and scattered and forgotten by everyone except those who study the history of flight and those who carry the stories in their families like heirlooms. But the idea remains. The notion that travel could be gracious, that crossing an ocean might be a pleasure rather than an ordeal. That somewhere above the clouds on a machine made of aluminum and horsehair and human ingenuity, people once dined on linen and slept in berths and woke to find their shoes polished, waiting in the soft morning light. The light through a porthole, 10,000 feet above the sea. The steady thrum of 4 Wright engines carrying 40 passengers toward morning. The smell of coffee, drifting from a galley no bigger than a closet. And all that water below, the Pacific, vast and blue and patient, waiting for the next clipper to come. They don't come anymore, but for a little while they did. And that, perhaps, is enough.